So what's up, guys? So for tonight's call, we wanted to shift gears a little bit here and talk more to the strength coaches, personal trainers, clinicians, or any practitioner of people within any capacity in regards to exercise, and speak on the topic tonight of the importance of creativity and thinking outside the box in terms of our own personal coaching styles, philosophies, etc. And this bleeds into how we either prescribe exercises, program workouts, or even prescribe therapeutic exercise to the people we work with. So either to return them to just activities of daily living, return them to a high level of performance, or keep them at a high level of performance. I think I could safely speak for all of us and say that our common denominator between all of us is that we aren't afraid to traverse movement, try new things, aka we do some weird shit sometimes. And tonight we have our good friend, Coach Tim Kelly on. He's one of the strength professionals over at Virginia High Performance here in Virginia Beach. I definitely don't want to speak on anyone's behalf, but him and Danny have gotten, created this little niche with their athletes and working around injuries and folks with not too common traditional cases. I could personally probably say Tim, Danny, and Nicole definitely are my Mount Rushmore of strength coaches who I steal shit from for my rehab. But in all seriousness, the drive to just continue to push the limits on what we can conjure up in terms of exercise to help our athletes we work with, those results will definitely speak for itself. So for tonight, it's going to be more of an open dialogue. Here we're talking shop. I wanted to loosely base this discussion off of Tim's latest article published on Ruderock, Coaching the Coach. So if you haven't read that, I strongly encourage you guys check that out. So some talking points tonight, the importance of creativity, how to navigate new things and seek new resources, the pros and cons of non-conventional strength training, integrating this restorative strength piece without sacrificing high performance, personal goals within ourselves, and how does this all benefit like the athletes listening at home. So without making this longer-winded, intended, I'll pass it along to really anyone. So just to start this off, I guess what's the importance of creativity to you guys, especially with like the athletes you guys work with?
As far as the creativity piece, I mean, I think that social media makes it really easy for everybody to pull from a lot of different avenues that aren't necessarily conventional performance training. So I would say that we have an advantage over some of our forefathers in the strength and conditioning field. I think of someone like Boyd Epley or even Mike Boyle or somebody like that is like, a lot of stuff that they were being creative with and experimental with, which obviously now it's just conventional performance training. They had to kind of like do it themselves or like go find a VHS tape of somebody, or like even worse, like obviously all the Russian manuals and things like that to go look at these little black and white kinetographs and things like that and like look at something and then use their imagination to be like, how can I bridge point A, point B to point C? So we definitely have it a lot easier now, but at the same time it becomes easy to get distracted with all of like the fluff, especially with you see like I would say a bulk of the people that look at especially using social media workout exercise videos and things like that. If you just look at like the story, or not the stories, but the discover page, like it's all like flashy, like just like look at me type stuff, and that's not what we do. And I think a lot of people think that that's what we're trying to do, but there's a lot of context and thought that goes behind it, and it's just a little snapshot of somebody's whole program. So like, people see us doing maybe some dynamic movements with like some bands or like a tidal tank and all these things, and they think we're just trying to like just do something different for the sake of doing it different, but it's not. I think people see some of the exercise videos that we do, and like I said, it could be something simple. I think of like the last one you just posted, Danny, of like some of the hip exercises. Like, what's this guy doing? I don't like how's that going to help me? But it's like, no, like there's some very small, minute kind of arthrokinematics that happen at all of our hip sockets that, you know, if I do that exercise, I might not get anything out of it, but Danny might use it with a guy who's had 2 hip replacements, and that's going to help him get synovial fluid, and it's going to help him get blood flow to an area. It's going to help him improve motor control in an area that he just can't move well. I might be able to move my hip just fine. I'm like, nah, this doesn't do anything for me. And that's where I think our creativity comes in, is like, you know, we don't do that with every single person. It's on a case by case basis. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I mean, you covered a lot of ground there, but you know, the like kind of the preemptive points of all of this is, you know, and this without getting into the inner workings of VHP, but there's a somewhat unique population that's being worked with. So there needs to be some kind of abstract approach. You just have to. 2, we get a lot of contact time with our athletes. So there's, you know, what I often say is where most coaches have the difficulty of, you know, having all these different variables and having to fit it into 3 hours with their athletes or 4 hours across the week. Our problem is actually trying to figure out how to productively populate, you know, 8-10 hours a week of training. So to Tim's point, you know, the layering and the maneuvering and the nuance of it is just something that's kind of refined over time, because we're always put in different situations to force different ways of thinking. It's, you know, we very rarely get like routine cases or you know, back-to-back cases that are similar.
To piggyback off of that, I think part of the reasons we do post some of those things that are creative is because a lot of the guys that we do work with, they can't do some of the conventional performance training methods, even though they want to and we want to do it with them. So it's like, I have to figure out how I'm going to apply some kind of load that's going to apply adequate stimulation to create an adaptation. And then 2, you know, I have these other variables where it's like, I can't do that from the conventional training standpoint. So how do I do that? And that is almost, it's creativity out of necessity.
Right. So it's born out of necessity. And then the other thing that I've latched onto, and Jeremy, we've spoken about this as well, but it's just the mindset of being curious, not causing. And I think that's one of the biggest kind of mistakes that a lot of coaches make, is that, you know, we're so hell-bent on like having to always have an empirical answer or an exact solution or an exact recipe. And it's like, man, it's kind of ambiguous and it's tough. And there's a lot of moving parts to this. So I think for us, it's in our best interest to try to pursue more, you know, out of that curiosity side, rather than just simply trying to come to an objective endpoint.
Right. And even like with this creativity thing, I think that's where we get a lot of this kickback, where it's like, oh, they're just doing stupid stuff just to get likes or views or whatever. But then again, it's like, you know, the viewer off social media based off of like a 15-second video, they don't know the context of what's going on. And again, like what Tim said, it's almost like conventional methodologies like failed them to a point. So now it's like, how do we get these adaptations we want so they can continue to do their sport, do their job, etc., stuff like that.
Yeah. And I don't ever use the word creative, ever. Yeah. I never think of it like that. And I never even like try to interpret things that way. But I do sometimes feel like we are crafty, right? Yeah. Or resourceful is another one. You know, and finding just these different ways to create an efficient and an effective outcome that we feel couldn't be achieved or done otherwise. You know what I'm saying? Like, very rarely is it like, I wonder what we can get out of this, or I wonder how it'll go if we try it this way. You know, something that I stole from Stu McMillan out at Altus is 70% of the time I'm doing what I know works, 20% of the time I'm doing what I think works, and then 10% of the time we're just figuring things out.
And I would say with the guys we work with, it might be a little more like 60, 20, 20, just because of the nature of who we work with, which gives us a little bit of more opportunity and more experience to fail more and then get more results out of it. We're trying to expedite failure while mitigating risk, and then obviously using kind of intuition or educated guesses based off of that kind of 70, 20, 10 rule, which for us is a little bit more on the 60, 40, 20 rule. So.
Yeah.
Well, and I think a lot sometimes too is, you know, that like craftiness also kind of comes from the athlete themselves. So like when you're trying something, even if it's something, non-conventional versus conventional, when you're trying something and they're like, I'm getting feedback here, but I don't really feel it here where you want me to. And then being able to kind of like take a look at the movement that you're doing and transform it into another way, put them in a different position, try the load in a different position, and then that creativity kind of builds on itself, and a lot of it is almost athlete driven as well.
For sure. Yeah, communication is a huge part. I've learned a lot of shit from my guys. Go ahead.
So Nicole, like how do you kind of integrate all that stuff with like Olympic lifting per se?
Yeah, so I mean, with Olympic lifting, a lot of it is, we're working just in the sagittal plane, and that's really it. It's very bilateral with the exception of the split jerk. And so we use it really we've actually started to use it more throughout every phase of their programming, but it started out as kind of our GPP phases after our athletes were competing, as a way to get them away from those traditional lifts that they're so used to doing. And a lot of the problem with them is they're so strong and they're so powerful, and these movements are almost like humbling for them, and they're like, oh shit, I can't actually rotate this way, or I can't balance in this position, and they're breaking a sweat doing band work more than they are when they're snatching, cleaning, jerking, and they're like, what the hell is going on? But kind of taking some of those more like non-traditional movements and finding newer ways to target those main muscle groups that the snatch and the clean and jerk hit, but just from a different way, just to kind of like we talked about, in previous discussions, like making them more bulletproof than anything else.
Yeah. And when I think of motor learning too, I mean, even though it's something that seems really simple, you're just doing two movements over and over again in Olympic lifting. I mean, between all the Olympic lifting derivatives, between changing tempos, changing timing, pauses, all those different things have a huge influence on the nervous system and allows for them to learn the movement. So that variation is huge. And then especially with you having, your background, Nicole, and having Danny as well, giving you a bunch of different options to try out on you and him as well. I'm sure you've been able to incorporate a lot of unconventional Olympic lifting things that have really solidified that motor learning pattern that maybe wouldn't have worked or would have taken a lot longer to work doing just barbell derivatives. So it's pretty cool.
If you don't think she's made an impact or influence at ECG, just go check out Phil's Instagram over the last couple of months.
Exactly. Yeah. That's kind of my point.
I mean, with being crafty and trying to I guess, come up with different things to, I guess, reach all these stimulus kind of adaptations. How do you guys personally try to navigate all this or seek new resources out?
It's the same answer that Tim started out with for the creativity. It's social media. I mean, for as much shit as you have to now sift through and how difficult some of it can be, especially the last couple of months or whatever, it is an empirical resource. You can literally hand search any single craft, subset, focus, whatever of this entire industry. You've been great for me on, but for the younger coaches, right? You can see in real time what all of these, Hall of Fame coaches are doing. Eric Cressy and Mike Boyle and Pete Bomarito and Cal Dietz. I mean, to be able to just walk stride for stride with them while you're learning this shit for the first time. I mean, how is that not an extreme advantage? And then the second thing I would just add on quickly there is that, I buy shit. When these people put products out, I buy them. And 99 times out of 100, I'm walking away from that a better coach. So all the information is there, man. There's no information barriers and there's no resource barriers if you have Wi-Fi connection. And I think it's just really, incumbent on the coach or the organization or companies to put an emphasis on development.
Yeah. And you got to train it yourself too. I think that's one that, especially now with this flood of information, a lot of people are quick to take theory and try to apply, but I don't know. I mean, yourself, your N equals 1 thing is always going to help you understand it better, I think, even if it's only for, 3 or 4 weeks at a time. And it's maybe even just in your warm up, you're just experimenting with a couple different things in your warm up. Like that's enough for you to start to understand whether you're going to let it sift through your filter. I know Mike Boyle likes to say that a lot. So we'll use that term.
You know what you see, you understand what you do.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like on my end, it's kind of easier for me because I'm just focused more on like the rehab end. So my biggest influence on navigating all that is just simply, I ask myself, what strength and conditioning? Because when I graduated like athletic training school, you have 1 semester of just like rehab courses, but you got to cover like head to toe. And it's like very simple shit. But when that stuff doesn't, there's a plateau or you reach kind of this block, all my stuff is just literally strength training. And I just call it rehab. And because for me, it's like, sure, we have all this like social media stuff, but then that can get overwhelming for me because I'm like, do I try this? Do I try that? And all that stuff. But then at the same time, it's easy just because I have that autonomy to do that. And then all I'm doing is just bridging gaps between rehab and then the actual like performance piece. So
yeah, and so we can pivot right from that and kind of get more into pros and cons of the conventional SNC, because Jeremy, we've been talking about this shit for like 3 or 4 years, 5 years now, that the paradigm for performance in rehab, in our opinion, is just fundamentally skewed. And we see these 2 separate things, while in reality, they're always coalescing, and you're just at some different point of this spectrum. But to that end, I'll go ahead and kick this one off because I think it gets a little bit misconstrued sometimes. But as far as conventional strength training is concerned, it's an absolute fundamental. It's a priority for virtually any single athlete that I can think of. And I would say,
I would argue human. They do a lot for healthcare. Just have people do strength conditioning.
It's fundamental. And I think that when people see a lot of the stuff that we're posting or talking about or whatever, like we can't forget that can't be ignored. It's just, we don't feel that it's valuable or necessary to just post shit that everybody should know and already is doing. To that, I think it's fundamental for another reason, in that it's the portion that the athlete can retain and then become autonomous with. With a lot of the crafty shit that we're doing and a lot of the nuanced stuff that we're putting in, these aren't things that athletes can just pick up and take and run with, right? And ironically, we're usually more quick to self-prescribe them, refined miniband work or SMR work or whatever it is. I think, we undervalue it a little bit. But anyhow, when we teach them the fundamentals and the foundational movements, that's now a skill set that they have and they can utilize for themselves. The more that I can give them, the less I have to focus on when I have time, right? The more we can sub in new stuff. So then there's that. And then I think that, for all intents and purposes, it's the best ROI for your time invested. You're just going to get the most out of it for what it is. But the problem is that we're so archaic and we're so like almost zealous to it, where we feel like once we've reached this point where we're seeing, very minimal return, we just try to do the same thing more with more intensity and more volume. And then, maybe change some tempos and change some positions, whatever. But you got to start doing different shit. And then it ultimately always boils down to, what is the definition of strong enough? How strong do you need to be for what it is you do and in the way in which you do it? And that's where I would probably get into a lot more of an argumentative type of discussion with people, because there's a lot to shake out. But I think we just generally overvalue a lot of the foundational stuff, and we're not quite broad enough with what we do.
And I think another con too is like different stuff is very threatening to, like, I guess, like the old school crowd or just the big 3 crowd, which, sometimes I'm like, am I doing too much dumb shit or crazy weird stuff? Or, you know what I mean? Like, that's kind of my con. And then again, like what you said, you have to kind of make sure that you're justifying what you're doing and you're still kind of reaching your goals you set for your athletes you're working with.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, like, I'm now having to think about programming through the lens of, if I'm an athlete in Rude Rock Remote, in a public gym at 5 o'clock. And all I've known for 5 years is me and VHP. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's really given me this radical perspective shift. But, so I think about something recently, a band cable row, right? So taking a purple band, tying it to the cable and using that for a row. That's a phenomenal exercise for a lot of reasons. But there's a lot of good value to that. But then my limiter is nobody wants to do that shit in Gold's Gym.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody wants to be that person. So I think from on the coaching perspective, it's a similar limitation where it's something stupid like not wanting to take time to set it up, not taking the time to try it out to see what it feels like, not seeing how it works with athletes, just being sheer laziness.
Right.
And I think that's a big barrier too.
Well, and I think a big barrier as well is with something like Ruderock Remote, even though we provide all of the videos for everything, that new shit is almost like a little intimidating because it's like, well, I know how to do a cable row, but now you want me to attach this thing to it. And it's different in working with athletes and kind of having them having your guidance and being able to see how to do it and then going and assimilating it for themselves versus just being like, all right, here's your program, here's what the video looks like.
Yeah.
Have at it.
And Tim, you're probably better than any of us with this because of how versatile your training is. I mean, you'll go through heavy strength cycles with the conventional lifts. You'll go through, you just finished a gymnastics cycle. You do Muay Thai and you'll get into condition. You're all over the place, but it's so organized.
Yeah. That's where I think auto-regulation and understanding your principles really comes into play. Obviously, it's not something I would just kind of tell my athlete to go, oh, yeah, go do your own thing. But once you learn, and it's funny, you were talking today with one of the guys about it, but once you learn your residuals, it's up to you to decide what you want to prioritize, really. I mean, like I said, like how strong is strong enough? Well, I would argue, especially with a lot of the guys that we work with and the guys you work with, Jeremy, most of them aren't strong enough, especially in the eccentric loading capacity. And then on top of that, their movement literacy between those movements. So anything that's really dynamic, eccentrically loading, or anything that's really heavy loaded, they don't have they don't have enough training history to transition from that, which is where once you get a couple cycles of that transition, so we'll just use triphasic as an example, because you go from eccentric to isometric to concentric to a peaking speed block, like you're getting every phase of the force velocity curve. And I'm not saying every guy needs to do triphasic, but it's little things like that a lot of the guys we see, they've never had a focused portion of that. They don't know what we're talking about when we try to articulate. It's like, hey, like you guys deal with a lot of environmental forces. Like, if I had a perfect world, when you guys come into your job, you would do a lot of eccentric loading before you go and do your work, right? Like it's like, especially if they're like a high school athlete or something like that, it's like that's where you build the tissue health and resiliency, and then usually that's where those guys break down. So it's like I may not necessarily do super maximal loading with my guys, but I do a crap ton of eccentric and negative work where I can fit it in, and I usually just reserve that for the days where I know they're going to have recovery time. And then on the days where I know they got a bunch of stuff going on, that's where I work my speed stuff, right? It doesn't have to be, and especially if it's concentric only stuff, I'm going to negate a lot of soreness that they may have to deal with when they're working. So it's like, once you learn your principles, then you can do it yourself. And that's where it's our job as coaches to, like, in layman's terms, explain the nitty gritty of like, hey, this is why we're doing this. Like, I don't need you to understand myosin and actin heads breaking and all the biochemical stuff that happens from it. Like, they don't need to know that. But if they know that it's like, hey, my body is resilient to high loads, and then I can transition into a really fast eccentric load, like you're going to be pretty healthy when you go to encounter those forces, or healthier than you would if you hadn't had that training block. So, right. I mean, that's my big thing is that, you need to cycle a lot of different training styles. And it's unfortunate because Dan, we only have our guys for 4 weeks, but if you have somebody for multiple years, you have the time to do that. And that's doing the athlete the greatest service, is giving them movement literacy and movement breadth or capacity, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
For sure. And with all that being said, I guess like how, from a coaching standpoint, how do you actually integrate that restorative strength piece?
Yeah. So we've kind of touched on a lot of these different facets of it throughout this already, but the biggest thing that it boils down to is it's still always 100% based on what the athlete needs. So like, you know, the pyramid that we've kind of created, you know, here with our 6 pillars, we're just analyzing 6 different traits or, you know, physical characteristics, then seeing which one has the most deficits or intolerances. And I think if there's anything that really differentiates RST, it may just be that we're putting more emphasis or value on certain variables that aren't analyzed or assessed in conventional practice. So, you know,
I would say
the
big ones that you hit, Danny, a lot are fascial health, kinetic wellness, which is what I would consider any kind of tempo, rhythm, or coordination-based strength and conditioning thing. And we usually incorporate it into a conditioning circuit. So you're hitting 2 birds with 1 stone there. Most of our guys think they need to kill themselves in the gym when really they need more of a green zone training adaptation, which is the perfect time. You're not fatigued. So you're going to be able to learn some of those movement skills that you need, and you're going to be able to get some of the tissue health stuff that you need to feel better, right? And that's what our guys need. So, I mean, that's mostly what we've been doing for a lot of our guys, but there's other things too that we hit in the deficit zones for different guys.
Yeah, and it's just filling the gaps. And I think that, you know, really where the disconnect is people think that, you know, if your program doesn't consist of bench, squat, dead, clean, then it's not an effective strength program, or you need RDLs, or you need this, or like the athlete just needs what they need. And if in most cases, those things are going to be prevalent across the board, but we're just putting different, you know, attention elsewhere. I think that the other thing is to be, you know, cognizant of is that training under high intensity with high volume under, you know, strenuous or taxing conditions is still 100% the priority. But, you know, as Nicole kind of alluded to with some of these, you know, abstract or non-conventional applications, they're way more fatiguing for people who are very strong with the conventional shit.
Yeah.
Because this is different for them. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? So.
Well, cognitive load is a real thing. I mean, we saw that with the guy that helped me with some of Muay Thai, right, Danny? So, like, the guy can hold pads for me all day. I'm wailing on him, right, and doing all the combos and things like that. And he's not even sweating, right, because it's a movement skill that he's absorbed over a long time. His cognitive load when he's doing that is very low, whereas my cognitive load is very high. So in that instance, my nervous system is on super sympathetic overdrive. His is probably parasympathetic. Then I have him do something new. For him is sympathetic, and for me is parasympathetic, right? So it's just those things, like that simple on-off mechanism, right, is really as simple as you need to make it, because that high cognitive load for that person, even though it's not a high actual load, is what they need. So,
right. And then to take that a step further, I would just say that, you know, and this is of course outside of like college weight rooms, you know, are obviously not included in this. You know, I would say almost all high schools as well. But for the rest of us and for a lot of the professional realm, it's really just about maintaining how good you are. You don't really need to get much better. You just need to not get worse and not get hurt. Jeremy, what do you want to finish out at?
Just a real quick, I know we're speaking to like kind of like the coaching performance staff side of things, but as a real quick, how do you think like everyone listening to this athlete wise can benefit what we're trying to say?
Take your health and wellness extremely seriously and make it an absolute priority. You know, everything from the big, you know, sleep, hydration, of course, all those things, but also consider stress management, emotional management, situational, environmental influences, you know, just generally how happy you are. Like, I think those things are extremely underrated, and they all feed into the same system. So if you have disruption going on with any of those things, it's going to eventually in some way, shape, or form compromise your physical capacity. So I would say take those things seriously, and then also to treat it like a skill. This is a skill. Training is a skill. So it's no different than any other element of your sport.
Don't be afraid to try new shit.
That too.
Yeah. There's a system to do it too. I wrote about it in my article. There's very much a system to integrate new stuff into the coaching philosophy